going to give people a couple more minutes to dial in.
It's 1 minute past by my clock, Sean. Should we?
Can we give people, like 3 more minutes?
Couple more. Yeah, I think so. Let's do that.
All right.
For those of you who are listening to the recording, just
there's about 20 people, and I would kind of expect more.
Mm-hmm.
There we go. More of the IAB. That's what I was expecting. Leif, you want to kick this off?
Sure.
I should probably unmute. Helps. All right, welcome to the Secret BOF. I'm one of your secret chairs, Leif Johansson, along with Sean. I think we'll make maximum use of the silly name during the proceedings. All right, and we're gonna. This is sort of pre-IETF 113-ish. As usual, this is run under IETF Note Well, so note the note well. If you haven't been to an IETF BOF or a meeting before, go read this carefully. It definitely is important for you to understand, especially with respect to the IPR issues involved. So let's flip to the next slide.
I guess
the agenda.
The only other point I want to stress here is that we do have code of conduct in the whole 9 yards. I don't suspect that we're going to have any problems, but I just thought it was worth noting.
Indeed. Here's our agenda. So I think we're going to spend just a couple of minutes talking about what we're going to do here. What is a BOF and what are we trying to achieve? We're going to get a presentation from both proponents here, Matthew and his team. We're going to talk about the problem of secure credential transfer. We're going to try to keep that sort of item 3 relatively short, so we have a lot of time for discussion. We're going to keep as much time for discussion, and then we're going to try to do a little bit of a charter discussion afterwards. We have maybe some wordsmithing to do, look at charter text, and we're going to be, as chairs, we're going to be asking a couple of questions at the end to make sure to understand whether we actually have what it takes, what's needed to establish a working group out of this. So, Sean, do you want to give us the highlights of running a successful BOF? What are we looking for today?
All right, pause. What we're trying to do is make sure that the problem statement and the use cases are kind of well understood by people, and that this is work that the IETF, is the right place to do. And not just that there are actually people that are willing to read the drafts, participate in writing them, the whole 9 yards. And for this particular group, I guess one of the points that was raised in the dispatch area, it's the art area, and on their dispatch list was to make sure they had enough security chops involved in the let's develop an apps thing. And I think we can get that. We just have to make sure that we might specifically ask, are there enough security people in the room to actually, lend some eyes to read? And then after that, after we figured out that there's enough people that are actually interested, it's, can we get it done? Do we think we have enough? I guess we have enough people. Are we happy with the words, which essentially in the charter, which is the pact that the working group would be making with the ISG to get their work done, and then are the deliverables clear? And so we actually do have some words that are proposed. I personally hate reading the words out during a BOF, but sometimes that's what you got to do. And then people want to wordsmith on the fly. My attitude is we get to that point and people are relatively happy with things, that we'd switch to hedge docs and we'd cut and paste the charter text and go to town. Otherwise, we can just do that later. Because to me, I think it's kind of like if people have a general sense of, kind of the size of the square, then we can figure out, what color to paint it, later.
Right. I think what we're going to do now is to let Matthew run his slide deck. And I don't know, Sean, are we going to ask people to hold questions, or are we going to break for questions during? I'm inclined to think we should let the presentation go through and then have as much have discussion and questions at the end.
I tend to think that flows best too. So let's give that a shot and see what happens.
Right.
All right, I'll stop sharing.
Right, and I think Matt, you wanted to go run your own deck.
I think maybe if I click ask to share slides here, we can see if this will work properly. So there are two here. There's chair slides and the other slides. Maybe I'll choose the other ones. Yeah. And click share. Is that coming through okay? Okay, great. Great. Well, thank you so much, Leif and Sean. Really appreciate the introduction. And I also, appreciate everybody joining. I know we had a lot of great discussion on the email threads as well. This is a topic that, myself and the other proponents are obviously, very passionate about solving. And so it's really exciting for us to see people come together and talk about it. In terms of questions, I think, I'm happy to follow Leif and Sean's guidance to kind of hold questions towards the end. I guess the only caveat there would be, maybe if there's a clarification, like something in the slide or something that I say that doesn't make sense, or that folks want to clarify what I mean by that, I'm, totally okay if people want to jump in and ask for clarification. But for further discussion, at the end, that would be, totally fine. So we'll go through the slides here. Myself and a couple of other proponents as well will be speaking to other slides in the deck. Hopefully we'll go relatively quickly. I know this is content that we did present mostly at Dispatch. We've also sent it out a week or two ago. And so hopefully we can, save a lot of time for the discussion. So our goal is obviously to establish a working group. And in this discussion, we want to, we do have a potential solution in the form of the draft, but really want to focus on explaining the problem statement and the use cases that we endeavor to solve. And then, clarification questions are obviously welcome in this forum. So let's start with the problem statement. So a lot of users take advantage of the security and convenience of having a digital credential on their smartphone. You first saw this crop up back in 2010 or 2013 when folks could add payment credentials to their devices, EMV payment credentials that could be used to pay over NFC, and then it's kind of spread into other what I'm calling verticals, transit and access and other spaces that are not just paying monetary value for a good or a service, but getting into a subway or entering your corporate building or getting into your home or your hotel. And these smartphones and their associated operating systems are obviously manufactured by different companies. And the credentials themselves, as I mentioned, come from different verticals. So it could be a car, a home, a hotel, a place of business, in the access realm, could even be something to do with transit, like riding a subway. And the real meat of the problem statement that we want to solve in the working group that we hope to establish is to allow users to share these digital credentials with other individuals. And we'll go through some of the detailed examples in the use cases section. Today, no such standardized method exists that works completely cross-platform, meaning regardless of what company manufactured the actual phone, and which company manufactures the operating system, and then cross-vertical, just meaning that we want this to solve for different types of credentials, as mentioned earlier, like access credentials, transit credentials, and things like that. Richard, I see that you, I think, raised your hand. Did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I just want to make a quick clarifying question here. When you talk about credentials, obviously, that can imply a bunch of different stuff, but it sounds like a particular property from a kind of security point of view of a credential is that it has some secret stuff that the credential transfer service is probably not authorized to. That should only be accessible to the end devices that are holding this thing, and the device uses it in some other system for access. Is that the right way to think about this? Basically, it's a symmetric secret.
Yeah, great point. I'll touch on that real quick. So there are different types of credentials, namely symmetric based from a crypto perspective and asymmetric. Let me give you an example of both. One common example of a symmetric credential is a MyFair Desfire applet running on a mobile device. And there is a symmetric key that was derived for that user. It's derived from an intermediary symmetric key for a specific property. If you look at hotels, a lot of them use MyFair Desfire. And that's obviously an applet technology type and a protocol. And that is a symmetric credential that cannot leave the device. And the handshake between the device and the actual terminal, there's some crypto there. There's a MAC. There's lots of crypto in that interaction. That the door that allows the door to verify that credential. That's one example of a symmetric one. An example of an asymmetric credential could be a digital car key that complies with the CCC standard, which we'll talk about a little bit later in this deck. Those are asymmetric credentials in that you have a private and public key on the private part of which lives on your device. And that's how you get into the vehicle. You also see this in ISO 18013 for mobile driver's license. That's an existing public standard that's pretty recent. So there are examples of both symmetric and asymmetric credentials. I think it's safe to say that, for asymmetric, you never can have the private key leave the device that owns it for obvious reasons. And the same thing for symmetric, right? And so, obviously the crypto is very different, but That's one of the reasons that in sharing a credential, you can't just lift this thing off of the individual who endeavors to share and give it to somebody else. There's tamper-resistant aspects there, and also you wouldn't want the actual same key to exist on two people's devices for sort of obvious security reasons.
Great, thanks for the clarification.
No problem. Okay, so moving on here, we'll talk about some of the assumed constraints. Now, some of these constraints are factual in that they are existing constraints that exist today, either in other open standards like CCC, for example, like I mentioned, and some of these are constraints that we kind of want to assume on ourselves that our solution should have to solve for or live within. So, like I mentioned a few minutes ago, the actual provisioning, which is just the verb that is often used to get a credential onto a user's device, and the usage of these credentials is very specific to different specifications and protocols. So I've already mentioned ISO 18013, there's also CCC, and then there are other proprietary ones, for example, MyFair DeskFire, which itself is an open standard, but the way that MyFair DeskFire is used in the industry, right? Different companies like Hyatt or other hotel brands are defining their own file structure within MyFair DeskFire for what keys and applications and data are needed to unlock their door. We don't endeavor to dictate how these are provisioned, managed, or used from a transaction perspective on the different devices and platforms. We only endeavor to solve for how they're actually shared. And so, for example, the solution that we want to come up with inside of the working group would not dictate how a credential was ultimately provisioned onto the recipient's device. That would be up to that platform. We only want to cover the transfer aspect of it. Secondly, in this very highly mobile world that we all live in, we really do not want to require both devices, so the sender and receiver, to have an active internet connection concurrently for the transfer to be successful. Let me give one quick example there. Digital car key, adhering to the CCC spec. Cryptographically, if I want to share to Sean my existing private key that the vehicle trusts, must sign a public key and associated attestation from one that Sean's device will generate on the fly during this sharing. For that to work, I need to get that public key from him, sign it, and give it back to him. And obviously, with devices being in airplane mode or coming online and offline at different times, that's a challenging thing. So, we just want to say that we do understand that there's a back and forth that's needed. It's kind of impossible to get around that, but we don't want to require both devices to be online at the same time. And the best example of that is if Sean is out hiking in the woods with no connection, I should be able to initiate a transfer to him that completes when his device comes back online. That's the simple version of it. And then it's probably obvious, but these credentials are very sensitive. Some of these credentials, let you into somebody's home or hotel room or vehicle. We want to consider a lot of the security and privacy aspects of the transfer operation itself. Also, I mentioned this earlier, but there are security primitives that are guaranteed by the hardware, and I kind of use guaranteed loosely. I mean, obviously, tamper-resistant is a better way to put it. We don't know if anything is tamper-proof. It's not possible to just transfer the credentials themselves. And I also mentioned briefly earlier that cryptographically that would be undesirable even if it was possible. You never want a private key owned by two different parties, right? We want the recipient to generate their own key pair and have similar permissions, for example. So we want the sender to authorize the receiver to provision or to register a new credential with whatever privileges and entitlements that the sender has. And I say subset because I could own a vehicle and share it with my partner, and I want him or her to have the same exact privileges that I do. We co-own the vehicle. Or I might endeavor to share it with a valet individual at a hotel or restaurant, and I want them to have fewer privileges, like maybe they can't open the trunk, for example. And then lastly, we talked about this, that protocols like CCC do require specific cryptographic data from the sender. So we do need to comply with that if we want this to work for credentials that adhere to the CCC open standard. As mentioned previously, the transfer operation may take multiple steps. That is inevitable for certain asymmetric credentials, such as digital car keys. That's okay. We just don't want to require the devices to be online at the very same time. And lastly, if we really want this standard to work across platforms, with devices manufactured by different companies and operating systems that are created and owned and operated by different companies and ones that we don't even know about yet, we really think that the sender should be able to share the credential over any communication protocol, such as SMS, email, proprietary messaging applications, third-party messaging applications like WhatsApp or WeChat or any of these things. If it was limited to a very specific set of communication channels, that would mean that it's a little bit more proprietary, and so we want it to work really over any communication channel. With that, hopefully, if there are no further questions, I don't see any hands up at the moment. I'll hand it over to another proponent, Casey, and she will talk about the different use cases that, oh, actually, before that, looks like Michael, you have your hand up. Did you want to go ahead?
Yeah, hi, Michael Richardson. So I'm trying to understand to what extent these credentials obey some specific standard and to what extent the verifier of the credential needs to be involved in this process.
Michael, is that do you think that's a clarifying question, or should we save that?
Well, I think that you go back to the previous slide, the assumptions that I now understand you're not going to pass around the private keys. So it seems like you're assuming that the verifier is willing and able to participate in this process. The relying party, that is.
Well, I think it depends on who the relying party is. In the case of digital car keys, the actual verifying party is actually the vehicle itself, right? And that's a little bit different. I do think in the IETF specification that we ultimately come up with, if we're able to establish the working group and work on the solution, yeah, the sender and receiver will have to have software baked into their devices to adhere to the transfer protocol and perform the necessary exchange of data back and forth to facilitate the transfer. And that is required, and it is different for different credentials. It will look a little bit different for CCC in terms of what actual data is being transferred than it will for, like, for example, a MyFair Desfire or hotel key. There are some credentials that already adhere to an open standard. The best two, to use an example, is ISO 18013 and the CCC digital car key spec. And there are other proprietary ones that use public open standard technology, like MyFair Desfire or some other technology, but that the file system on that applet is proprietary to whatever company, whether it's a corporation or a hotel. I don't know if that helps answer your question or not. Maybe we'll continue and we can hopefully leave a fair bit of time at the end.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm going to pass it over to Casey to talk about the use cases a little bit. Casey, go ahead.
Sounds good. Please let me know if you hear me. I was just trying to start my microphone and everything crashed. I'm back. So
Works.
First of all, yeah. Okay, awesome. So first of all, we'll be talking about the vehicle use case. Matt described a little bit of this in the previous slides. But I'll go into a little bit more detail. So for all of these vehicle use cases, we can assume that we are complying with the CCC open standard. So we have, accounted for the different scenarios as that standard has laid out, including the back and forth between the receiver and the sender. First of all, say I own a vehicle and I have a digital key for that vehicle. I would like to let my friend borrow the car for the weekend. So I would maybe want to give them their full permissions. They can drive everything. They can open everything. No issue for just a set period of time. In another example, say that I own a vehicle and I now want to share that with my partner. In this scenario, I'd like to share this vehicle with them indefinitely without any restrictions, as if they were a co-owner. But maybe I got the car before we were partners and, they weren't as part of the car originally, the car, whatever it's called. Sorry, I'm blanking on the word. Next, Imagine I have a car with a digital car key and I've gone to a fancy dinner or a hotel and I would like to give my car to valet. I'd like to give them maybe some restricted access for a short period of time, and maybe they can only drive up to 25 miles per hour and they can't enter into the trunk. They only need to be able to drive it and park it. Matt, next slide.
Do that. Looks like Richard has his hand up. Richard, did you want to ask a question
sorry.
before we go to the next one?
Yeah, just one quick clarification here. Kind of looking at the kind of reverse of the partner case where you had access before someone else and you granted them access. Is there also a need here to have a revocation where, say things go badly between my partner and I and we go our own ways? Is there a need in this protocol to be able to revoke access as well?
Yeah, it's a great point. I mean, we do envision if you initiate a share or a transfer, that you should be able to pull that back and rescind it if the recipient has not accepted yet. We do think that there is a revocation needed after the share, but it's almost separate from the transfer flow in a way. And I think the reason that we're kind of thinking that, and obviously we could talk about this further in the working group, of course, but is that the actual revocation really depends on the way that the credential is used and the kind of credential authority, right? And so, like, here's one example. In the case of transit, if you look at transit in Japan and in China and other countries in the world, a lot of it is what's called kind of truth on card, where it's purely the credential on the device or the physical plastic card that's communicating with the terminal and doing the crypto handshake. Those turnstiles are not online; they're fully offline, right? And so to actually rescind that company, let's say for example JRE, Japan Rails East, right? They need to push a new credential to this deny list. And that needs to make it to all of their turnstiles. This is actually how it works. And they do that once per day, between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. Then when you tap the next day. And so long story short, the revocation may be a different mechanism than the actual transfer itself. But we do think that we do need to solve for that use case.
Okay, so I'll just flag that's probably an important scoping question when we get to the kind of what scope we're trying to tackle here, whether we're just talking about granting access or whether we also want to have revocation in scope. Thanks for the clarification.
Yep. No problem.
Well, great. So in the last slide, we were mainly talking about the different time scenarios or exact entitlements you might want to transfer as part of the share, but we also deem to solve these different online offline scenarios as Matt started to discuss. So I will talk about two different scenarios we were thinking of. Say I own the vehicle and I want to share it with my friend. My friend is currently out hiking and don't have cellular service, but I still want to share my key with them. So I initiate this share and send them this share link. And once the device comes back online, they're able to receive and accept this share. And there should be no issue with the fact that they weren't online at that time. So, this should be able to be asynchronous. Say on the flip side, I own the vehicle and I want to share to my friend. I've sent a share invitation, but then I myself has gone out hiking. We're hiking a lot in this group. And now I would like my friend, once the recipient has accepted my share, it should be able to finish the share should be able to complete once my device has come back online. So there should be able to be situations where the sender or receiver device can go online and offline throughout this transaction, but continue to work once the devices are all online. So now we will talk about the home use case. So say I own a single family home and have a smart lock, a digital key on my front door. I have a dog walker that comes on Thursdays to walk my dog Skipper. He's very active, and when I'm at work, I need the help. I would like my dog walker to be able to help to enter my home on Thursdays between 8 a.m. and 12 p.m. only. They should only have access to that front door lock. Conversely, say I own a home and I'm having a friend over. They are going to get here before me. Maybe I went out to get some groceries, and I would like them to have access so that they don't have to stand out in the cold. So I would give them a short term, I would share for a short term, and that they can get into the front door only as well. Next, say I have a housekeeper that comes on Fridays. They don't have a consistent schedule. It's not clear exactly when they're going to get there or when they're going to leave. So I want to give them access for every Friday, just throughout like a large window during Fridays. I want to be able to send them a key that will unlock the front door on that day. Lastly, say I own a home and I want to share a digital house key with an individual renting my home for a period of time. So in this scenario, maybe it'd be a larger period of time than these short-term access points. And maybe I want to share a front door lock, but maybe I'll keep the garage locked so that they can't have access to that. These should all be possible through our mechanism. Lastly, we're going to talk about a hotel use case. So say I'm staying at a hotel next week, and this hotel does support digital access credentials. So I've made a reservation, and I've provisioned the credential onto my phone. However, my significant other is also joining me, but they don't arrive until the day after I do. So I would like to be able to send them the hotel key digitally so that they can access the room as soon as they arrive, in the off chance that I'm not there when they get there.
Before you
Next,
continue, Casey, there is Eric, do you have a clarifying question? Eric?
Yeah. So just a question about scoping here. What capabilities are you assuming, I guess, about these about these underlying systems you're accessing? So I guess, like, so as a concrete example, you said like smart lock, front door, separate locks, right? I assume you're assuming that those systems all support this kind of very fine-grained authentication fragmenting, because I know, for instance, some hotel locks don't support any kind of fine-grained authentication fragmenting, right? So I guess my point is these are use cases. I mean, just to make sure I understand that this is like within the bounds of what the existing authentication system supports, with the assumption that each key is profiled to some, like, each key is already pre-existingly profiled to some, like, to some set of uses, or that'll be out of scope or whatever. So for instance, like, as a concrete matter, like, we don't have to like lug around the does this system have to like lug around like the ACL as well, or is that all out of band?
So I think what you're saying at first, I think, is very true. So all of these use cases are kind of describing exactly what would happen, but all within their own protocol. So within the CCC for digital car keys, there's already predefined use cases, and these different sometimes we call them entitlements. So whether or not you can drive quickly, or if you can have access to a trunk, or just to drive the car or to get in, those kinds of things have been predefined. We're not trying to solve exactly how a user would, with the IETF, we're not trying to solve how a user would choose these different fine-grained levels of support, but we wanted to show how it would be used in real life once we're able to transfer that credential, if that helps. So the protocol itself that we're trying to get a working group for is just making a flexible mechanism that allows a sender to send these over to a recipient, but less so about why a hotel can have this kind of fine-grained support and why a car can have a different level. Those things are out of scope for this talk, but it does paint a picture for what we're doing.
Sure. Let me try this question differently. Maybe more instructive. So, like, let's take the example you had previously of the valet, right? And so, like, I want to give the valet a key. That says you can only drive the car, 25 miles an hour or whatever, right? Is the remit of this protocol scoped to passing that key around and there's some other mechanism that is used to instruct the car that it can only go 25 miles an hour, or does this protocol have to include a mechanism, although presumably just a hole for an opaque blob that says that somehow gets communicated to the car along with a key that authorizes it to drive 25 miles an hour? Like, which one is it?
So
We're assuming as part
try,
of the, oh, sorry, Matt, go for it.
No, it's okay. Let me just add a little bit of color here, if that's okay. Look at. Let's take a simple example, just to answer the question. Look at single family home, where the owner unlocking the door with their phone takes place over an NFC transaction with the ISO 18013 protocol for secure credentials. All ISO 1803 compliant credentials is basically a public key that's signed by some authority that the lock trusts. That's how it works, right? Inside of the payload that the authority signs, there is space already in the ISO 18013 protocol for things like dates and times, schedules, limitations. All of that exists inside of the ISO 1803 definition today, right? So if Casey wanted to share to a dog walker for Thursday, what we would be facilitating is getting, let's say she's sharing to you, Eric, getting you a credential that's signed by, the correct private key of the, that the lock trusts in that single family home that covers an ISO 18013 compliant credential with the right dates and times, and the lock would actually be the one that's doing the enforcement when you tap, if that makes sense.
Sure, I think it makes sense, but I guess the part I'm still a little puzzled about is, like, someone has to. There's some, as you say, there's a trust anchor that signs the key, right? And someone has to tell the trust anchor, when you issue to this person, like, issue them for the following hours, right? And I'm trying to figure out if this protocol has to convey that information, or if that will be done in some separate unspecified way.
Got it. Got it.
That's what I'm trying to get at.
Yeah, there's two variants. It depends if the credential authority is what we call kind of quote unquote local and quote unquote remote. So for example, digital car key, like Casey said, you own the vehicle, you are the credential authority. Like it's you, right? So you would be signing some data that does get sent over this transfer protocol. It absolutely does. In the case of a remote credential authority, let's say Casey's sharing a Hyatt hotel key, it's actually Hyatt that has to sign, not the sender. The sender is authorizing that, right? And Hyatt is the one that's issuing a new credential. The sender would just tell Hyatt, hey, for this new credential that you're issuing, this is the restrictions that I would like to see. And Hyatt would respect that, and the sender would authenticate however they do so, like, could be FIDO, could be something else, to Hyatt. So it really depends on if the credential authority is local or remote, but we do want to support both of those variants.
But even in the local case, though, it sounds like from a credential transfer point of view, I do whatever local operation to make the signed blob that the car is going to parse. And then I put that into the credential transfer protocol. So the credential transfer protocol is only dealing with the thing that's signed at the end of the day, however you created the signed thing.
Yes.
Is that right?
I agree with that. Yes.
Thank you.
All right. Casey, go.
Well, I think we had Tim's hand raised.
No, Tim is camping out in the queue to ask questions later. He's sort of pitched his tent over there. So let's, Casey, go back and present.
Okay. All right, great. There's just one more use case we wanted to discuss. This would be, say I am staying in a hotel, and I'm the one that has booked the reservation. I tend to organize for all my friends, and of course, I've done all the work for this trip. However, I have paid for 3 adults to be staying in this room. So I would like to be able to share access to the 2 other individuals that are also on the reservation. So they have the exact same digital access credentials to enter the room, or anything else I might have access to as part of this credential as well. So these are the main use cases we've been discussing. As we just talked about a moment ago, we are expecting that some sort of, sometimes we call it like a token of what exactly this credential should do will be the thing traveling over this protocol, but we won't necessarily, as part of this protocol, we're not defining how a user would decide, or how a user would just work with their credential authority to choose what access the recipient would have. mainly just getting that choice over to the recipient. So now I'll pass it on to Dimitri to talk about requirements.
Thank you very much, Casey. I hope everyone can hear me. My name is Dimitri, and I'm going to present the requirements section. Some of the requirements are already defined by the assumed constraints presented by Matt and explained in the use case sections presented by Casey. So hopefully, like most of them, make sense now. So the first requirement says that the solution should utilize, should apply security measures to transfer the credentials to intended recipient only. So let's say I want to send a key to my car to Alice, so which means I don't want Bob to be able to intercept it and provision it into his device. The second requirement states that we want the solution to utilize sender's preferable communication channel to transfer the credential to receiver. This may include channels with various degrees of security, such as instant messaging applications, WhatsApp, SMS, email. And the first requirement about the security of the solution must consider the second environment, that we should be able to utilize various the channels with various degrees of security. The third requirement is about connectivity to internet. So Matt already mentioned that we don't require both sender and the receiver to be online at the same time. And well, I think the reason is obvious. Some people don't necessarily might have connectivity to internet because of weak coverage or because they just activated airplane mode on their devices. But for sender to initiate the share, they might be able to connect to internet, create the share, and go offline. So later on, when the receiver goes online, they receive the share. They should be able to provision it to their own device. Thank you, Matt. So the fourth requirement says that solution should support multiple types of credentials. For instance, a key to a car, a key to a hotel room, a key to a multifamily home. So everything which was explained by Casey earlier. And we also should support both open specification, open standard solutions such as ISO 18013 or card key, digital key, or proprietary APIs such as MyFair Desfire. Based on symmetric and asymmetric key types, requiring logs to be online, having a connectivity to credential provider, or offline, having built-in cryptographic mechanisms to verify credentials. Emphasis here is that the scope of the solution is limited to the actual transfer of credential and not the credential provisioning part or credential verification. So how the credential works, how they managed is not a part of the solution. The fifth requirement is that the credential transfer shall consider user privacy. So user private information, such as who they shared the credential with, for what credential type, at what time, and for how long, must not be collected or tracked by the solution. The solution should not allow to build a social graph based on the information coming from the user, and that is important. And the last requirement, Eric, please go ahead, please.
You like sort of like expand on that requirement a little bit more. I think, you know, so I mean, at the very limit, like for instance, does this have to see all the IP addresses of the people that are that are transferring the credentials? I guess like I'm trying to get, does it have to conceal the public keys? I'm just trying to get a sense of how you scope out this requirement.
Yeah, that's a good question. So we might receive a lot of personal information from the user, and we really don't know what's in the data stored by the solution. But we need to make our best effort not to store that information. And let's say I'm initiating a share to Matt. I want to share my key with the Matt. So the solution shall not know who's gonna redeem that share. Is it gonna be Matt or is it gonna be someone else? So the way I pass my voucher to Matt shall be independent from the way the voucher's data is stored, if it makes sense.
Thank you.
Of course. And the last requirement is
Let's see if Michael has a clarifying question.
Yes, certainly. Hi, Michael.
Said several times, I want to share my private something, and I'm continue to be confused back and forth. I think you want to share your access, not your private key. That's what I keep hearing. And so
Yes,
I think it'd be useful if you try to discipline that thing, because otherwise we're confused.
Yes, you're absolutely right. I'll do my best not to mention private keys. A credential to a car. That's what I meant. Thank you very much. So the last credential is that the sender should be able to cancel share before it's redeemed by the receiver. So the solution needs to implement a mechanism to basically not allow the provision, the credential which already has been revoked. Christopher, do you have a question?
Yeah, I think I'm confused by this last requirement with what I saw earlier in the slides, in that it was both parties did not need to be online during the transfer.
Simultaneously.
Right. So if, like, for example, the sender is not online, how exactly is the cancellation expected to be done? I'm just tripped up by the online offline requirement here and the desire to be able to.
Christopher, is this a clarifying question or are we into discussion land?
No, I think that's a clarifying question.
Okay,
but maybe it's not. If it's not, we can defer it. I'm sorry.
Yes. So the point here is that we don't want them to be online simultaneously at the same time in order to transfer the credential, right? But at any given moment, obviously, to initiate the transfer, sender needs to connect to the network, right? To store that information somehow and to pass a link to that information to the receiver. At the same time, we don't require the receiver to be online at the time of the share initiation. When the receiver goes online, eventually they receive the credential transfer information, and at that time they shall be able to provision the credential into their device. The same holds true with the share revocation. So obviously, if I'm the sender, in order to revoke the share, I need to connect to the internet, right? To pass some request and get some response from the solution. Yeah, so it's all true. The only point here, we don't want both parties to have simultaneously connection to internet.
Okay, thank you for clarifying.
Absolutely.
And
yeah,
I think we're actually towards the end here. Oh, sorry, Dimitri, go ahead.
No. I just wanted to pass the button to you, Matt. Thank you.
I jumped the gun a little bit too much there. Well, I was going to say that was the end of the slides. Thank you, Dimitri and Casey, also for presenting them with me. So, I mean, I think Leif, Sean, I'm not sure how, but I mean, we can jump into Q&A now.
Yeah, this is the discussion part of the both. So, good. Patrick, go ahead. Patrick, we're not hearing anything from you. All right, audio problems.
And just to Christopher, just to reiterate on what Dimitri said, the short answer is you 100% have to be online to cancel. That's the short answer as the sender, right? We just, as Dimitri mentioned, we don't want sender and receiver to have to be online concurrently. But any operation such as initiating a share or canceling a share, the device performing that action needs to be online to complete that. Okay, I think Richard was first there.
Right.
Yeah, I was going to just relay Patrick's question for him because I also thought it was a good question. The question was whether the sender, there's a requirement here for the sender to be able to get an indication that the recipient has access to the resource, which I guess would mean that you could no longer be canceled, et cetera.
Yeah. We do, that is a good question. I think it's a good point.
So what was the exact question? Sorry,
Hey, Matthias, they're saying that it might be a good idea for the sender to receive an indication that the receiver has successfully received the transfer and now has an active credential.
Yeah, actually, I would say also that depends on the use case. For car keys, for example, the car maker is involved, and the car maker needs to get the information that the key is active now and a new key has been created, because they need to register that for insurance purpose. They always need to keep track of how many keys exist for a given vehicle. So they are necessarily in the loop, and they will send a notification to the owner device in that case that everything is good on receiver side, and they have now a key that they can use on the vehicle. And following that, they're also involved in revoking the key. So either we call that friend, let's say, or the receiver deletes their key on their own device. Then in that case, the friend secure element would generate a termination attestation to prove that the key is now unusable. That will be registered also by the car maker to delete that key from the list of keys issued for that vehicle for insurance purpose. And then also the owner could request deletion. And there it needs to go first to the car OEM or the car maker, because there are security requirements for many car makers that you can't just delete the key while the friend is driving, for example. So the vehicle will decide when is a good moment to actually delete the key, which is in some cases, for example, if the car is locked or used with a different key, and only then the key would go away, and then that's all the task of the vehicle OEM, and they would then reach out to the receiver device and revoke the key once it's successfully revoked in the vehicle. So just to give you an idea, that
somebody made a point. Before you
outside
get on the queue, Richard,
Yeah.
somebody made a point in chat that like this is the audio recording, like people need to understand the audio recording. So say your name as you start speaking. It actually helps people understand it who just listen.
Oh, sorry, yeah. Matthias Ash, Apple.
Okay.
That you. My name is
Yeah. So I think the question was actually simpler than that. The base interaction we're talking about here is sending a credential from one device to another device. And because of the async requirement, that's in two operations. There's the sending operation and there's the receiving operation, right? And so the question is, if I'm the sending device, I know when I've done sending operation, and presumably the receiving operation happens, but can I as the sending device know through this protocol somehow whether that receiving operation has happened? Yeah, and I guess at the level of requirements, like, does this protocol need to have that capability?
Yeah, to me it feels, that's Matthias again, to me it feels it can be an optional one, because it can go either through different rails or it can go through the protocol, depending on the use case.
Alex here. I think in a lot of the use cases we've been thinking of, the share acceptance is confirmed by the partners, who usually are the credential authorities. But as Matthias said, it could be a good optional addition for future use cases.
Yeah.
Just
Thanks.
to add to Alex's point, I was just going to add to Alex's point for a second. Just receiving the information, the credential information, doesn't necessarily mean that that user has then accepted that share or is actually able to use that access credential yet, until we have some information, or not. We as in, the sender device knows that that partner has actually communicated to us and said, yes, that recipient has accepted the share and successfully provisioned or got that credential onto their device somehow. Just knowing that the recipient has clicked on or like somehow gotten access to that information might be helpful, as we can definitely discuss farther, but it doesn't guarantee that that user has successfully gained access to the credential you wanted to, until the partner has told us. So just wanted to give that little extra, and you can go on to your next question.
Thanks. So it sounds like, just to read that back, protocol we're talking about here might not be everything that's involved in transferring the credential at a semantic level, since there's some other credential protocol bits going along around the outside that might fail, even if the transfer of the bits has succeeded. Okay, thank you. I have another question, but I'll unqueue again.
No, sounds good. I think the way that at least I do it in my head, it's kind of like a triangle where the sender and the receiver, just picture kind of the bottom two nodes. The transfer between them is necessary but not sufficient for the full ecosystem of sharing in terms of revocations after and seeing what's going on. That third node at the top is typically like a remote credential authority that has connectivity and APIs to these two devices. Again, could be Hyatt, for example, it's a Hyatt pass. You're sharing between the two of you down here, sender and receiver. And let's say that completes successfully. The only entity actually in the world that will know if the receiver is fully provisioned actually is Hyatt, to be honest, because they're the ones that are actually issuing that credential. That's different from car key. To Matthias's point earlier, that car key works differently because the owner is the authority. But so that triangle, I think, is an important paradigm to a number of the questions that we've heard earlier too. That's how you would revoke. If I shared with you that's fully successful, that was 2 weeks ago, now I want to revoke, I would actually ask Hyatt, kind of from my device to Hyatt, and Hyatt would then do the revoke down to your device. I just wanted to add that clarification.
Yes, and yeah, maybe to add that just a little bit, I think we can say there is a push and a pull model. In the Hyatt case, you would basically send over this relay channel a token that allows you that you would redeem at Hyatt, and Hyatt will push your credential into your receiver device. And for car keys, it's the other way. So the owner is actually giving the actual credential to the receiver, and it is push and pull, depends on the direction. It is registered by the credential authority, which is the vehicle OEM, but it is not issued by them. So that's I think the main difference here, and it needs to work for both cases.
Eric.
That I understand what responsibilities are in scope here and what are not. Let me start with the easy case, which is the case where I give return my car keys for the next month, and then 2 weeks from now, I decided she wasn't driving my car, and I want to deal with that. We don't have to deal with that. That's like, that was some unspecified mechanism where I like call Toyota, right? I push a button on my app or whatever. Okay, good. So people nod their heads just to confirm that, like, that's what everybody thinks. And then in the case where the thing is in flight and he has not yet retrieved it, the situation is that, once again, like, I somehow notify Toyota or whatever, but then Toyota does not effectuate the transfer when he comes to pick up the key, right? That's the assumed mechanism for this, right? That is, there's not some new protocol mechanism we have to invent to stop that transfer being effectuated just because he hasn't picked it up yet.
Yeah, I don't think so. I mean, there's one case that's kind of in the middle of the ones that you just described, Eric. Oh, and this is Matt speaking, which is there's actually 3 back and forths needed for car key, right? Number 1, the owner of the vehicle initiates the request to the recipient. Number 2, the recipient generates a key pair and sends the public component of that key pair back to the owner. And number 3, the owner signs that with their private key and sends that back to the recipient, right? If those 3 don't happen, it won't work. And so, for example, after the first one that happens, you could just initiate a cancel on that transfer directly from your sending device to the server managing this stuff, and that would successfully cancel. But your earlier statements were also correct for transfers that have already successfully completed.
Well, is the queue drying up? No.
Richard's back.
Richard, go.
I'm happy to talk some more. So, I mean, it sounds so we have these, on the one hand, authentication and access control requirements that the credential only be sent to the intended recipient. And on the other hand, we have privacy requirements that we don't want the transfer service to know who's who. So it seems like that sort of implies that there is some way to establish who the intended recipient is, so that the transfer service can verify that it's the intended recipient without knowing the identity of the recipient. Does that sound right?
Yeah, this has been tricky. I'll be honest. This has been tricky when we've been thinking about it, because not only are those things somewhat at odds with each other, but anyways, it's a hard problem. I don't want to like prescribe anything about our solution that's up in the draft, because I know we want to focus on the requirements here in the problem statement. But I'll just say, like, some of the things that we have done. Here's one example. When the sender shares the data that the recipient needs to receive the transfer, the sender is encrypting that data with, let's just pretend, a brand new symmetric key that they generate on the sending device. They then put that data onto this transfer service. The transfer server cannot decrypt it for obvious reasons. And they're sending the symmetric key in a URI fragment of the URL that they're sending to the recipient. And the idea there would be the recipient can download the data from the relay server, and then only that recipient can decrypt the data. So we've sealed off, or we've attempted to seal off the, oh, sorry, Richard, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Okay, we've attempted to seal off one potential attack vector, which is a malicious transfer service or somebody who has compromised the transfer service. There remains additional attack vectors. For example, if I sent it through SMS and somebody captures that SMS, of course, now they have the symmetric key. And there are some other things that we were thinking of. So, like, for example, the recipient device would generate a UUID or GUID when it receives the link and sends that up to the transfer service when it gets the transfer request the first time. The transfer service then binds, quote unquote, to that UUID, so that if somebody else happened to guess the transfer identifier, which is a hard problem from an entropy perspective, but pretend that they did, so like basically the first person to receive it wins, which has pros and cons. I'm not touting it as a solution that's amazing, but these are the kind of things that we were thinking. So like the short version is have the data field level encrypted such that the transfer service cannot read it, kind of one primitive. Have the key that's needed to decrypt it only sent between the sender and receiver, no server, and that helps kind of seal that off. And we have some other ideas also for the protection of that channel. There are some interesting things that we've been thinking about, like a potential second channel with the PIN code. So you have to compromise 2 channels in order to truly compromise the link, like maybe SMS, and then you call the person and say, hey, the PIN code is 1234, or whatever the case may be. I don't know if this is more appropriate for the working group discussion rather than here, but I just wanted to share some insight as to what we've been thinking about with privacy and security.
Yeah, thanks. And I think that matches the intuition I had as well. I think from a requirements and kind of scoping point of view, the important thing I think to capture is that we have this transfer service, which is sort of oblivious. It doesn't know a lot about identity information, and we presume some other service that is being used to establish who the intended recipient is in a way that the transfer service can then verify. And so I think we'll have to figure out what this working group is going to commit to do in terms of that secondary service, because it sounds like you want to be a bit flexible, but maybe we want to define what data elements go over that at least, or maybe define the format for those data elements. But I think just at least establishing a separation and acknowledging the existence of the requirement for a separate channel will be important in kind of laying out the scope, and it'll obviously be important in the security analysis later on.
Yeah, absolutely. Fully concur with what you said. And Eric, just before I hand it off to you, because I see you have your hand up, I also just wanted to add that, one of the things that we think is that the identifier of this transfer that is kind of established when the sender first initiates should be large enough and with high enough entropy that it's, for all intents and purposes, impossible to guess, right? I think probably everybody kind of understands that, hopefully, and agrees with that. And the knowledge of that when the receiver comes to the transfer service to complete the transfer is sort of necessary and sufficient for the transfer service to provide the encrypted data. And then, of course, the second layer there is that the recipient has to have the key to decrypt it. And thus, we're kind of reducing the problem statement, almost ignoring the transfer service then at that point, and reducing the problem statement, to your point, Richard, purely to the communication channel or channels that are used for the sender to communicate to the recipient. And hopefully that makes sense. Eric, I see you have your hand up there as well.
So actually, the thing you just said surprised me a little bit, which is to say, I've read your draft, and the sort of the implicit structure of your draft is that the sender sends the recipient a mailbox with a secret identifier and a symmetric key that it can use to decipher the contents of the mailbox, right? And I guess I'd like you to talk a little bit about why you think that what requirement you think gets you that the mailbox has to have a secret identifier. Namely, here's the super dumb version, right? Which is to say that the mailbox is entirely public, and anybody can read it, and they're just enumerated 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and that the symmetric key is sufficient to decrypt, and you try to decrypt, and it works or doesn't work, right? And I'm not saying I would actually run the system that way, but I think it'd be worth trying to tease out what the requirement is that gets you that the mailbox has to be secret, because I think that's obvious.
Yeah, that's a great question. In my mind, there are 2 or 3 things. I'll state those, and then I'll close my mouth so the other proponents can also answer as well, whether it's Dimitri, Casey, Mateus, or others, because I'm sure people have their own opinions here too. But one opinion would be that this mailbox is relinquishing encrypted data, right? And obviously, the only person that should be able to decrypt that is the recipient with the symmetric key. Typically, in cryptography, it's a bad idea to have your encrypted data be open and available for anybody to look at, because they can typically, determine some ways that it's encrypted and things like that. But I think more importantly, it also allows the transfer service to do things like rate limiting, right? Basic, DDoS attack prevention. You can limit on the mailbox identifier itself, for example, and that's more practical than theoretical. But I think that's helpful. Whenever you are sharing with anybody in the world, you kind of don't know who they are. Sending them some kind of a secret that's, in this case, it could just be this UUID that you mentioned, is, having possession of that, in my opinion, should be a requirement for them to download the data. It helps, prove is the wrong word, but it helps towards them having received the message from the sender, versus just like, let's pretend we use like a, monotonically increasing integer, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, etc. If anybody in the world could download the data from any mailbox, then they would be able to kind of, attempt to decrypt it and all kinds of stuff. It just felt like a good idea.
Well, I guess I'm a little surprised to hear you state this as a cryptographic principle, because I typically operate the opposite assumption, which is the data transmitted on the network is available to anybody, and the cryptographic key is what protects it. Hence, like, TLS or MLS or whatever, right? So, so I think like that's I think like I think if we don't assume that the cryptography is sound, we have much more serious problems.
Totally. Yeah.
I think the part I think this goes to the threat model against the relay server, which is like, what's the trust model against the relay server? I guess I'd be uncomfortable if we built a system that did not provide security for the system, even assuming the relay server is entirely compromised, right? So I think that probably has to be laid out a little bit. Anyway, I'm not necessarily saying it's a bad design. I'm just saying like what are we depending on here? It seems like
no, it very well maybe that's the whole point of we're trying to get a working group so we can kind of
I think there's one more thing you sort of indicated that sort of hand waved around. I think maybe or implied was attempting to persuade the relay server that that you were the correct recipient, right? So I think one question is like like in this environment, right? The relay server is persuaded at the time of download that the UID, but is not persuaded the cryptographic key that decrypted, right? And one might imagine forcing the recipient to prove they could decrypt it, right? So I think just trying to sort out like what the access control situation around the relay server is, and especially when you start talking about having like a URL fragment, and you say like because one of the reasons we use URL fragments is like try to like allow the relay server to learn the UID but not the key and that kind of stuff. So I just think trying to dope that out will be helpful going forward. The second thing I wanted to say is I think we probably need to like nail down the implied sort of properties of the sender recipient channel a little bit more. And Richard was kind of poking around that a little bit in particular. It seems to me that like the properties you seem to be envisioning, and correct me if I'm wrong, are ones in which there is no cryptographic binding effectively of any material to the recipient, and namely that it's like SMS, where like I assume it's confidentiality and the system provides confidentiality, but I have no idea what key material of any kind is used to provide that. So all I've got is this encrypted channel, right? That hopefully is delivered to the right person. And secondly, it seems to me you're assuming that it has some minimum bandwidth requirement, which is to say it's large enough to contain a cryptographically relevant key, but also a maximum bandwidth requirement, and it is small enough that it cannot contain the entire bandwidth. And so I think trying to like lay that out a little bit probably would also be helpful. So we understand what we have to work with, right? And I think in particular, trying to lay out, I think what the minimum like effectively like the minimum MTU of this channel would be like very helpful. SMS is large enough to have any plausible cryptographic key, but like just like it doesn't have to work. It doesn't have to work if it can't contain 256 bits or something. I think it has to be like or maybe 500 bits or whatever. I think that'd be helpful to lay out.
Steven?
Yeah, maybe I give it a first shot, Matthias here. I think the relay server itself has very little security properties. Probably the most important one is to release the credentials that have been deposited there only one time to one receiver. So it needs just the first receiver grabbing the link is the one, and once this is done, it should not be possible for any other receiver to copy the credentials, meaning to duplicate them. The encryption is indeed, as you said, it's a secure channel. The cryptography is chosen to be strong, but the one who has the key can decrypt. So I think that's mainly for privacy, but not really security, because it depends more on who has the key than can anyone crack or break that encryption, right? And then how does the key get to the right person? And that is unfortunately a very hard problem to solve. I think especially if you talk cross-device platform. Within Apple, and I'm sure within Google, within Samsung, there are proprietary methods where you can bind much stronger the identities, and you can be much more sure that it's going to the right person. And for a universal sharing mechanism, there needs to be a second factor, or there can be a subset where you can do some identity binding, provided, for example, the receiver has an email account that is already verified, and maybe the email account owner could attest to something, but that would not work generally. So I think we can't really put that in scope. So it's a very simple mechanism, and to recall, the main problem to solve is it needs to work independently of the device platform, because we could do iMessage, AirDrop, whatever. Google could do something, Samsung could do something, but for a really universal thing, we don't have really good identity binding, and we need a simple protocol that is open for basically everyone to participate.
All right, Stephen, I'm going to let you in here now.
All right. So I have a question about the expected implementations or deployments. Who do you expect would select the relay server? Would it be the platform or the credential owner, or who?
Yeah, we would envision that the sending device would be the one that selects which relay server they would initiate the share or the transfer to, and it would typically be, it could be any relay server, but it would most likely be a relay server hosted by the company that manufactures that operating system. Although you could kind of use whatever relay server you want. You could also envision third-party applications. So for example, a iOS application for BMW, right, who has digital car keys, initiating a share against a relay server that BMW themselves hosts, and that's perfectly acceptable as well.
Oh, yeah, I guess I need to think. There's obviously a lot of consequences flow from that as to what privacy issues you have to kind of consider, and possibly as well whether there are kind of issues related to kind of spammy mailboxes or those phishing attempts and so on. So I think that's something I'd like to understand better myself personally. Thanks.
Sure. Yeah, no problem. Sorry, go ahead. Did I interrupt somebody?
Yeah, maybe to give another use case that makes that a bit, or that widens a bit the landscape of possible usages, is for the moment we're talking really device to device physically. Like I'm the owner, I'm a private person. I share my key with friend, family member, etc. So that's then very likely the sender device OEM will set up the relay server just for practical reasons. There's no obligation or any technical reason. It's more practical reason that generally a device OEM, if they set up their own relay server, they can bind the device, the sender device, very strongly to that relay server and have very little danger that it connects to a fake relay server and is tricked in something. If we think about business sharing use cases, I think we haven't discussed that, but it would apply there as well. For example, you have Hertz or Avis, who has a whole fleet of vehicles, and there will not be a Hertz employee running around with an iPhone or Google phone to be the owner of all these vehicles. It will be a server. So there is another use case where the server or the owner is basically a server, a device on a server, if you want. And then the use case is more on a contractual level then, because it would be a server-to-server connection to the relay server. And then the relay server on the other side would share to a real like renter device, to the person who wants to rent the key, so the car. And so that's a use case also to consider. And there might be other ways to bind. For example, let's say there is a security company who is really specialized in secure servers. They will offer that service, and they will very strongly bind the Hertz server that owns the cars to transfer the ownership to that secure server that is really the owner. Sorry, and then the relay server, there will be a contractual relationship, and it's very well identified. So I think there's also no risk, and that could be then any relay server that they choose to contract. So that's a bit our vision or our view. I don't think there's anything settled yet in that environment, but the situation is just a bit different here.
Thank you, Matthias. I want to get Richard a time slot now.
I was just going to touch on the last point. I think that flexibility around who the relay service is does underscore the identity point that Matthias made, because it's, especially when you have multiple verifying parties, like multiple transfer services, it's tough to come up with an identity service that works for all. What I was in queue to ask was more about, and yet more scoping around what we need to support here. It seems like in the schemes we've discussed, you have multiple different credential schemes running around that may or may not be supported on a given device participating in these transactions. Do you envision having, as part of this protocol, like some negotiation where I can find out whether the whoever I'm trying to send this thing to supports a Hyatt hotel key or given car key protocol?
We were thinking for privacy.
How we envision that a negotiation happening?
Matt, can I take this up, please?
Sure.
Dmitry. So, Richard, this is a great question, and we were thinking about that a lot. So let's say I'm sending my credential to my friend, but he receives them on a desktop device, which doesn't have the secure element, so we cannot use that device as a car key or as a key to the hotel. So we need to establish a mechanism to relinquish. So at the time when they connected to the mailbox, they claimed that mailbox. Now we need to establish a mechanism to relinquish the mailbox for them, so that now they can forward that link to the proper device, to their iPhone, to the phone, or anything that has the secure element on it. So we agreed that the solution needs to take that into account.
Yeah, I also want to say, like, I think I don't think for privacy reasons that we should create some kind of a system that acts as an oracle where you can send a transfer out and see what somebody's device does and doesn't support. We've kind of distinctly set that as a non-goal just for privacy reasons. Instead, the major manufacturers of these phones would have an error message on device that says, "Hey, Richard just shared with you a car key. This phone, upgrade your software to, be able to support it, or, this hardware doesn't support it," whatever they want to show. But I personally don't think we should send that information back to the sender. And then, just to add on to what Dmitry said, I also think that we need to have some kind of a fallback web page that's hosted by that same URL. So, like, if I send it to a device that you have that just has no idea about this service and transfers in general, if they click that link, whether it's an SMS or something, it's going to go to some web page, right, that's hosted by this transfer service because it's a valid URL. And again, we might show something reasonable there, like you receive the transfer and I don't know, some text basically.
Yeah, I think you're right, especially from the privacy point of view about being able to create an oracle here. It sounds like that we probably at least have a requirement to articulate what sort of credential is being offered when you go to receive one. so that you can make an intelligent decision. You can present an intelligent error message that says you've received a high key, and we can't use that.
And that was a recent addition, I think. Oh, sorry, Casey, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to add that to your point, Richard, there are, and it's even a more complicated problem because there's several different scenarios that could cause a credential not to be able to be received. It could be that, you sent this to your friend and you knew that they had the correct device, and as Matt said, they opened it on the wrong device. So that's one thing. Or it could be that the device is on the wrong operating system. They just need to upgrade. So that's another scenario we have to explain to the user of how to fix. And lastly, it could be that they are completely up to date on the correct device. However, their operating system hasn't created connectivity or worked to implement, that particular kind of credential. So all these different scenarios are very valid. We need to be able to explain them to the user. So it's a tricky problem to solve, definitely.
And we did, I think between version 0.2 and 0.3 of the draft, we did add some sort of enumeration-like stuff to show what type of credential was being shared, Richard. So if you haven't already, version 3, I believe, contains some metadata that will help the receiver determine what was shared.
All right, I just want to remind people that at some point in the, soon, we're going to bring up the chair slides again and start talking about sort of both questions. So if you have any outstanding questions about sort of the presentation and scoping and the issues related to that, please step up now. Anything that will help the both make a determination. Right, Eric, go ahead.
Yeah, I just probably useful to have for the record some sense of which major players in this ecosystem are participating and which ones are not. This is something that IETF doesn't know a lot about, and happy to see us do work here. But it'd be good to make sure that we're not missing a bunch of people that are important that are not going to want this. So I guess obviously that's a difficult question to ask proponents who obviously are in favor, but maybe you could just list out who you think is likely to be interested and involved in the standard specification. Although of course you can't commit to any product plans.
Or if there are other people in the room who'd like to express their interest.
Oh yes, thank you. That's it. Yes.
Richard, I didn't catch what you just said.
So I think Richard was or Eric was asking about sort of who are the engaged actors in this field, right? Who are the companies, who are the organizations who are interested in this, who's going to implement, etc. Right? Obviously, we see some big names on the drafts, but what are their level of interest, etc. Is that a fair representation, Eric?
Thank you. Yes, exactly.
Yeah, I do want to comment on it. This is Nick from Google, and yeah, I think we are one of the other proponent of this proposal here. And I think it's fair to say that this being adopted by something that we're working to get adopted by CCC. So we have vehicle manufacturers that are also interested in this kind of proposal.
Yeah, and then Apple is represented pretty heavily on this call as well, by myself and by others. So I think we do envision support from a lot of the larger manufacturers of smartphones.
I just want to say that I think that any statement that has just been made now or a minute ago is not meant to imply that the manufacturers are absolutely positively going to release this in the next version of their whatever. So I want people to be able to say whether they think their company is interested without being having their feet held to the fire absolutely later, oh, you didn't do it in version 12 or whatever. So thanks.
Joel, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, John.
Yeah, John Townsend at the mic.
Two small procedural comments. One of which is I hope we can really avoid calling this secret and introduce even more confusion. by people outside the IETF about what on earth our acronyms mean or are connected to. And the other is that substantially every substantive comment I've heard in the last hour and a half has been about security issues and not about applications issues. So I want to raise my question about the appropriate area and home for this again, just to raise it.
All right, yeah, thanks, John. Obviously, right, names aren't set in stone. If this becomes a working group, then it can be changed to be called whatever. I think the second question is more like I think it's more a question for our various ADs on the call, and if any of them want to step up to the mic and talk about potential homes for this, then go right ahead. In the meanwhile, I think Richard wants to say something, and
yeah, I'll plus one John's concern about the name. I would agree that we should find a better name for this. I agree that's minor. As far as applications versus security, I think this is going to have. I think this has more application design than security design. In terms of how things get indicated, how the bits get moved around. There's a bunch of kind of how do we arrange application transport stuff that the security area is not going to be ready for. I think we can get the right security folks in the room. Obviously, Ekra and I are already here, so I think we can get the security model right. And then but that's just kind of the core of the protocol, if you will. There's a bunch of stuff wrapped around that's going to need application attention. So I think you're right that this straddles the boundary, but I think applications is slightly the better place for it. While I'm here, the reason I queued is actually to continue that discussion of do we have the right community? I think Nick mentioned the CCC, potentially some interactions there. So we talked some about the device vendors who are involved. I was wondering if anyone from those kind of credential ecosystems, any of the kind of credential issuers or something needed to be engaged in this, and if so, if we've kind of have the right connections on that end.
Yeah, Richard, the applications argument convinced me when I raised the question on the list and got an answer. But again, empirically, at least as far as this BOF call is concerned, I haven't heard a single applications comment or question. I've heard nothing but security issues. And that's just something to keep in mind.
Well, I asked the content negotiation question, which I think I was an applications there.
So, Francesca, as area director, I will just jump the queue to
go ahead.
That's the queue as well, but then you can probably just say as well. But we AD, Art AD, and SEC ADs have been talking about it. We are synchronized, and we agree that this is cross area, and that I expect that. So we haven't agreed yet, or we were looking forward to this discussion to hear more from participants, what they think, where they think they should live if the working group is created. But I expect that we would do something like if it lands in security, that it will have an art AD. If it lands in art, it will have a security AD, just to make sure that there is coverage from us. But then, of course, we want to do what's best for participation. So just make sure that both art and sec are present. So yeah.
Thank you, Francesca. That's very reassuring and clear. So, Richard, are you in the queue, or are we letting Ben Cato talk? There you go, Ben. Go right ahead.
Okay, yeah, just to, I guess, reiterate what Francesca said. Yes, we acknowledge that this straddles the boundary between applications and security, and we're happy to place it as appropriate as we learn more, and we will do all we can to get the cross-area coverage. Just to John's point specifically about like the amount of time we're spending in this session on security questions, I would respond to that by saying that we're not talking about security mechanisms, we're talking about security requirements, and that once the sort of requirements of the application protocol identify what security properties we need, then the cryptography to use to get those security properties is pretty straightforward. And so, like, it's not really a question of defining the security mechanisms, it's a question of defining the security requirements and identifying them.
It's a great point. Eric, you want to comment on that?
I am entirely indifferent under which area this sits, but I do think that John is making an important point, which is, are we going to get enough interest from the application area people to be able to effectively execute on the application piece of this, which I think are significant, as I noted in my review. So I think, like, I guess what I would encourage is the chairs, the ADs, to, during this, the traditional call for, call for interest and whatever, to attempt to just in some way measure the temperature of both the applications and the security people independently, to make sure that we want people who understand, like, web dev or whatever it is, like, or email, as John suggested, so that we don't end up misdesigning the application components. I don't think that's particularly the case, but I think we should make sure.
I alluded to that earlier in the conversation to say that when we did our hums or the questions about, are you willing to participate, we could, literally ask, generally, is everyone interested? And then break it down. Okay, we're going to ask 2 more and break it down in the security versus apps, and to make sure that we've got a good constituents of people.
All right. Maybe that is our cue to bring back bring up our list of both questions here and see if we can take some temperature of the room. Do you want to get the slide deck back? All right. There we go. All right. So I think we're back, right? All right. I think, yeah, it's after that. Here we are. All right. So, I don't know. Do we want to try doing this with the show of hands tools? And the first. Or Michael, do you want to say something?
That's all.
Just to clarify, raise hand means you understand the problem, correct?
Yeah. Raise hand means that, yes, we kind of understand the problem. There is about 39 people in the session right now, and it feels like a pretty clear consensus that the problem seems to be well enough defined, right?
Do proponents have to vote?
No, I don't. It's not a vote. It's kind of we're kind of taking the temperature here. John, did you want to say something? John,
as apparently the lone dissenting voice, the questions about boundaries between certificate transfer and certificate management, and a number of other things leave me somewhat confused about where the boundaries are and what the work is, and consequently, I'm not certain I understand the question. And if everybody else is clear about that, then fine.
all right. No, all right. Point noted, John. Thank you. I want to see if we can get. So, Sean, you seem to have figured out how that tool works. So, I'm hoping you can.
So I'm going to do it. I'm going to tell them I'm going to make sure I'm not on mute, because I can't press any buttons or see anything when I'm running it. So you tell me when you want to call it. So I'll type in the next one.
Let's do the next one. Yeah, let's do the next one.
Right.
So the next question is the problem space worth solving in the IETF? And
all right, off we go. Oh, I guess for the minutes, we should say for. Oh, somebody's doing that. Great. All right, I think that's probably pretty good.
Yeah.
I would say that's pretty unanimous.
Yeah, we've got about like a little bit more than half of the participants in the on the session, so has raised their hands, and there are no dissenting voices or opposing voices here. So yeah, I think we can call this one.
All right.
And all right, this seems like for us, this seems like we're sort of we're on track here, that to be able to say to the ISD that this is worth a working group. The next couple of questions is sort of about available resources here, and in order to have a successful working group, we really need people who are willing to edit and review drafts. And editing drafts is often sort of, it's not. I think we need to assume that the proponents are not going to be the only ones who actually write text here. So like the first question here is, who is willing to edit drafts in this space? Not necessarily the only drafts that are being proposed now, but other drafts that can come out of this work. So let's take that temperature now. All right, we have like a fair number of people who say that they are willing to edit drafts. There are some who say that they won't be able to do that. We're going to ask the follow-up question in a next about reviewing drafts, which is almost as important to a successful working group. But we're looking at about 8 people who are willing to edit drafts. So let's go ahead and do the next one, who's willing to review drafts. Even more important, I would say, to get good reviews and lots of reviews is kind of the backbone of a working group.
And to note that we are going to go ahead and ask the subordinate questions too, in the art versus security, and you can categorize yourself however you want.
All right, exactly.
All right, here we go.
All right, fair number of people. So let's see if we can get. I am a security person, and I will review drafts. Versus I am an apps person, and not that I've never ever sort of been able to tell the difference really, but.
Okay, so setting it from an art perspective first. Art, apps, whatever.
Yeah. All right.
Choose one.
Kind of looks like a little bit like half.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And now I'll do it from.
Reviewing from a more of a security perspective.
Okie dokie.
My math says that there were more people who were willing to review drafts as categorized people than as, but I'm maybe a little bit off in my math, but it still looks good to me. Like sufficient number of people in the art area and security area are clearly willing to put in the work. That's very, very, very helpful. And we haven't sort of gone through so maybe we should sort of, we still have about a quarter of an hour to go. Should we just go take a look at the charter text and see if there's anything like obviously like bad or good, and see if how far we can bang this out? So at this point, anyone who wants to comment on this page, the charter text, and there's like a couple more, right? Just go ahead and put yourself on the queue and like make suggestions. Or, you know, I know, and Michael, you want to go? Michael and Stephen, go. Michael first.
Hi. So the first sentence of the charter says that we want to share a digital credential, when everything I've heard over and over again says that we want to delegate a credential to somebody else. So I think that kind of flows through the whole process, the whole charter.
Stephen?
Yes, the description of what's out of scope, I think, is a bit unclear and needs a bit of work. It's the language, but I couldn't quite follow exactly what was being said. And secondly, I think I'm not clear to what extent this work requires understanding the security and privacy properties of the credential mechanisms themselves.
Are you suggesting that those be put out of scope specifically?
The thing about out of scope is that I just think the phrasing is odd, so I couldn't quite parse it correctly. It's on the couple of slides ahead of there, the one you have. I think that's just wordsmithing, probably. But I think the more interesting question for me is that I'm unclear to what extent doing this work requires a full understanding of the privacy and security properties of the credential mechanisms.
Like any of the proponents here, you want to briefly speak to that point? Is there anything we could sort of put in the charter?
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, I think we can clarify the language a little bit. I don't think to work on or review the charter or the draft, I don't think you have to have intimate knowledge of the actual credential types and how they work. I think I forget who mentioned it earlier, but the purpose of the protocol is that largely the transfer service is sort of unaware of the details of the actual credential and the information being shared. So in my personal opinion, that would not be a requirement. And then definitely heard you on the wordsmithing. I should also note, I think we've gotten a couple comments before this specifically about the word multidisciplinary in the last sentence of that first paragraph. So we may need to wordsmith that a little bit as well.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm not sure I would fully agree that you can be ignorant of the credential mechanisms to that extent. Just to give an example, I had a student a few years ago did something about kind of MyFair Classic weaknesses and so on, and I can imagine that, you know, knowing that the potential vulnerabilities and security assumptions being made by some of these credential mechanisms might be important.
Yeah, I do think, you know, knowledge of them would be useful. I just don't think it would be required in terms of like comparing MyFair Classic to MyFair Desfire, understanding how, you know, CCC credentials, you know, work. It's just my opinion, but I don't see that as a prerequisite to, you know, meaningfully contributing to the transfer, just because we want it to be relatively agnostic and work for a very wide variety of credentials.
Sure, that's a fair point. I wasn't trying to imply that everybody needs to be an expert in everything, but I think that expertise is kind of needed in the room.
Understood.
My sense is also that we don't need to understand these in detail, but I think it is important, maybe like just briefly, at some point, someone should briefly write down what the underlying assumptions about these credentials might be and what they require. My impression is very little, but just like what like I think perhaps a non-normative document with a couple of diagrams that showed like how these things are supposed to work, would be of some value at some point. I don't think it's I don't think those should move forward. I'm just thinking it might be helpful as a reference point. Because
Maybe-
so many kind of abstract, right?
Eric, maybe the intent, maybe it's enough to say that the intention of the work is not to like have deep understanding of the underlying credential system.
I agree. That was my sense as well.
Yeah, I think that sounds about right as well. On the other boundary of the problem, now that we've nailed down one boundary, I think it would be useful to kind of distinguish this protocol from kind of a generic tunnel data between two users protocol, right? You could envision a protocol where I set up a tunnel to Matt's phone and we can push stuff back and forth. My sense is that there are some specifics to the credential case here to be added, but it would be good to kind of identify exactly how we're different from generic tunneling protocol.
Yeah, I think that's a good point.
Eric, and are you?
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, all right. All right, Ben, you wanna?
Yeah, I was just going to mention that in the chat has raised the question of if we want to talk about a person or a user agent, or potentially both, I guess.
Got it. So standardize on the sort of noun that we're using for what sort of entity is on the receiving side and the sending side.
On that note, smaller font.
This is like an eye test.
Hi, I could probably just send these as PRs, but I think these last two are not super helpful. I think they're good things to happen, but they're not protocol considerations. They're operational considerations, and we can't guarantee that the relay server will do any of them. So I think the privacy goals were for protocol design, and so like if we think the relay server, for instance, should not have the identity, should not be able to persist the identity of the sender or receiver, then we have to deny it that identity, not tell it not to store it, right? So I think like just in general, probably these two need to be rephrased in some way that is more protocol oriented. I'm looking at the left-hand side of this diagram. I just think, yeah, I think this, and then on the lower right-hand one, allow sender and device to quickly perform multiple round-trip communications. I think we're going to need some more understanding of what this context really means. So I relooking at your draft, I see diagram 1, which involves a round trip between involves a round trip, and sorry, does not involve a round trip, and diagram 2, which does involve a round trip, and trying to flesh out like what in some requirements language what's acceptable in those cases and what's not, I think is probably important. So I mean, just a concrete example, you said initially that they don't have to be online at the same time, and then you sort of said later, and then you show the thing with a round trip. And so those are a little confusing, right? Because exactly what the capabilities are needs to be fleshed out a little bit. So I'm not sure how that goes, but somewhere.
So did I hear you correctly? Did I understand you correctly, Eric, that you would be willing to sort of provide some suggested language?
So I guess I'm going to provide a PR. My PR is going to be removing these last two bullet points on the privacy goals, and maybe replacing them with some language about like denying information. Yes, I can provide some stuff. This lower right-hand one, I think the proponents have to like help out with, because I'm still like struggling, I guess, with like what the communications requirements of this channel are. And in particular, like it's like the situation is extraordinarily different if I'm always willing to have at least one round trip between the sender and the receiver, and versus I'm not. And so I think we have to understand what has to work under both cases. I think it's going to need to be fleshed out somehow, but it's not a charter issue perhaps, but we'll need it eventually. But yes, I can provide.
I agree. Some of the language here, it kind of approaches more like a requirements draft rather than a charter text. But the question is whether maybe removing charter text in order to clarify it and in order to make it sort of more clear could also be a good thing. I think we're at the point in the timeline here for today that we're not going to be able to fully bang all of this out. So like finalizing the charter online, I think is a good idea. What do you think, Sean?
I haven't heard it. I haven't seen anybody willing to get to the microphone to be like, this is horrible, go away, this is the absolutely wrong thing to do. So my advice to the area directors at this point is that, wherever the charter is getting banged on, whether it's on GitHub or Dispatch or Sec Dispatch or wherever, or the secret mailing list, that it be moved to that fora, and basically we start zeroing in on what a good charter would be for the ISG.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think I'm gonna, Eric, can we let Richard and Casey up to the mic, or did you want to speak more to your point, Eric?
No, it's just yet another meet echo yet again failing to take me off the queue when I said something.
Yeah.
I was just going +1, Sean. This seems close enough that we can workshop it on the mailing list.
All right, sounds good. Casey?
I had a quick question to those of you that have worked more on these working group charters in the past. So a large part of our requirements are that we're trying to make sure we're working with these open standards such as the CCC, and everything we're doing complies with those standards that already exist. Would it be helpful to add in references to those within this charter, saying that, this, especially for those round trips, we are trying to have a solution to transfer in accordance with this open standard that already exists? Or is that not helpful?
I think it does. I think you can add another paragraph at the bottom to say the other working groups that we will, interact with, including IETF, are blah, blah, and blah. And also to note that some of the credential, we can also, communicate with the other SDOs that are developing, example credentials, including blah, 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 something like that. So you can list a whole bunch of them.
I agree.
Okay, great. Yeah, I asked that mainly because I think that part of the reason the protocol we're trying to design is different than existing ones is because we're trying to make a very generic protocol, but within bounds that have already been predefined. And I think that makes it so that we're limited to existing, we can't use as many existing protocols because of these other limits. So I feel like that helps explain why we're doing it. So I'll make a note of that and obviously see what you guys think when we put it up for review.
Eric, comments on this last slide, but I do want to flag, I think probably this last line is not actually appropriate in this case. Often we do start the charter with assuming there's going to be a given draft, but I just drafted a number of good points, but I think it's also fairly far from what I think probably is exactly the right starting point. So I think perhaps that's a question for the working group in their initial meetings rather than being defined in the charter like it is here.
So if I'm not
jumping
out of Ecker, in terms of the starting point language, we sometimes also see the working group will use whatever draft as input, or other variations on that phrasing. I was wondering if you had thoughts about using it as input, but not necessarily a starting point.
I guess I don't think that's doing very much. I think the usual reason to have this text in the charter is to foreclose the question of foreclose a bunch of discussions about the overall architecture of the protocol, because we're assuming you're starting with one thing, right? And so essentially you have essentially instant adoption of that rather than a extended discussion. And input seems to me to say nothing. it's going to use messages of the mailing list as input. So I don't think that really helps very much. I think that the question is like, are we going to bake? I'm happy to have it, I suppose, but if we're going to, my objection is to baking the assumption that this will be the starting point, and effectively immediately working group adopted like into the charter, because I don't think it's quite ready for that yet.
Sure. Okay, so maybe it's better to just not mention it. Is what it sounds like.
All right, we're down to the last minute here, and I think that is kind of it. Sean, maybe a fair summary here is to say that while the charter needs a little bit of wordsmithing, there seems to be a pretty strong consensus to like push this to the IST and recommend forming a working group in some sort of near future. And there seems to be enough people who want to work on it too. And you're muted, Sean, I think.
Oh, I think, did I unmute?
Yeah.
Good? Oh, the only thing I would add is that to thank everybody who participated today for having a nice experimental way to try to run a BOF.
Yeah.
This worked out all right.
Even out of cycle for an IETF and a successful BOF. Yeah, that's a first for the IETF, I think. All right, thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
See you all on the,
Thank you.
whenever the working group is going to be called list. Bye.
Should call Fred, Frank.
Yeah, the Frank list.
All right. Ciao.
Bye.
Bye.